Ministry of Climate and Environment. The Ministry has the pleasure to co-host this event with OECD in the interest of openly sharing the content and recommendation of the review. A special and warm welcome to the OECD authors, our moderators and panelists, of course our Minister of Climate and Environment, Mr. Espen Barth Eide, and everyone in the room and those who are following online. First, some practical information. Please note the location of the emergency exits. This meeting is being streamed and will also be recorded. Nice to know. The report and summary is available in printed version in the room, but also online. We are very positive in the Ministry to this kind of review of OECD countries. Recommendation from the outside on how to improve our performance do always give renewed insight and may thus be an eye-opener in developing our policy. It's 11 years since the last OECD review of our environmental policy. I also had the pleasure to attend the launch back then. This time, we have chosen biodiversity and land use management as a special topic for Chapter 2. Topics that are not always straightforward to analyze within a formal framework. At the same time, knowing that these topics are more political, tense than many other issues, environmental issues, we are, as bureaucrats at least, desperately seeking for more knowledge based on advice in these fields. That's the reason why we have chosen this as a special topic. I will now give the floor to the Acting Director of the Environmental Directorate in the OECD, Mr. Alain Dessert. He will give us some introductory remarks and key points from the report before he and our Minister will have a short talk about Norwegian environmental policy. Please, Alain.
Thank you, Tom. Minister, ladies and gentlemen, let me first say that I'm very, very pleased to be in Oslo today to join you in launching the 4th OECD Environmental Performance Review of Norway. This is actually my first mission in my new role as Acting Director of the OECD Environment Directorate, and one of the first missions in over 2 years, as you probably know. I already had the honor to meet with you, Minister, and your team at the OECD headquarters for the Environment Ministerial meeting at the end of March. And on this occasion, ministers from the OECD's 38 member countries, the European Union and some partner countries committed to intensify their work on climate and the environment. Let me thank you again, Minister, for your active role during the discussion, which led to the approval of a declaration on a resilient and healthy environment for all, in which countries commit to do more to curb biodiversity loss, combat plastic pollution, align finance with environmental objectives, and accelerate climate change action. On this point, climate change, the important role of carbon pricing in closing the ambition gap and enhancing mitigation action was actually highlighted by several ministers, including yourself, Minister. And indeed, Norway has a long tradition of applying a wide range of economic instruments for environmental protection, and this encourages innovation and internalize some of the environmental cost of harmful activities. Norway was among the first countries to introduce a carbon tax in 1991. Seems like ages ago. To date, the nominal carbon tax rate in this country is among the highest in Europe and covers more than 80% of national emissions. This is way more than the OECD average, where it's more like 60% of emissions which are not covered by any form of pricing. Looking ahead, Norway is committed to provide a long-term perspective on carbon pricing, and this is very, very important. The Climate Action Plan proposes a scheduled increase in carbon prices to reach 2,000 krona by 2030. And this provides a really strong price signal and thereby encourages increased investment in renewable energy and low-carbon technology. Thanks to this gradual carbon tax increase, Norway is expected to reduce emissions by an estimated 8 million tons of CO2 equivalent. Now, the next step is to ensure an effective and socially balanced implementation over the next 8 years. And a first step was taken in 2022 when the general tax rate on non-ETS emission was increased by 28% in real value. So that shows you've already started to translating your plan into action, and this is really, really good. Now, we are here today to take stock of Norway's environmental performance over the past decade. As was mentioned, the previous 3 reviews were prepared in 1993, 2001, and 2011. The earlier assessments pretty much confirm Norway's strong engagement and support for environmental friendly policies. So without major surprises, this new review again finds that Norway's environmental performance overall has been generally good. Your country continues to be a front runner in many environmental areas. I don't want to get into too much detail because this will be discussed in panel and in the coming 2 panels. But let me just give a few examples of the good aspects of the performance. First, some key environmental trends. Norwegians enjoy good overall air quality. The country's 4 major cities rank in the top 20 of the European City Air Quality Index. Premature death attributed to fine particulate matter exposure is less than 1/3 of the OECD average, less than 1/3. Norway has also abundant water resources with generally high quality standards. The waste treatment facilities are excellent, using cutting-edge technology for waste sorting. Nearly half of municipal waste is treated by incineration with energy recovery, and landfills are becoming a thing of the past. Second, no other country has gone as far as Norway to decarbonize its transport sector. 2/3 of new passenger vehicles sold in 2021 are fully electric. Norway has also electrified 1/3 of its domestic ferries and is a pioneer in electric aviation. No doubt your experience can offer many interesting lessons for other countries in OECD and beyond. Third, your country also invests heavily in technological development and innovation to support its green transition. Let me just mention a few. Norway is spearheading a number of important initiatives. For example, the Carbon Capture and Storage Project, or CCS, known as Longship, which aims at kickstarting CCS development both in Norway and Europe. So that's one. Also, the development of hydrogen production with CCS and hydrogen production using electrolysis with renewable electricity. That's, of course, very important. Or finally, material recycling from car batteries, to name a few. These are all important areas for breakthrough innovation that could make a big difference in the longer term. Now, despite progress in many areas, as elsewhere, Norway still faces multiple challenges, including strengthening sustainable consumption patterns and biodiversity protection. Sorry. Again, we will have time to discuss this in more details in the panel discussion, but I just want to highlight again a few examples which caught our attentions. Norway has abundant water resources, but needs to tackle water losses. This is something the OECD flagged in a previous review, that the country's aging water supply and wastewater infrastructure requires substantial upgrades. Norway needs to adjust to new climate challenges, such as increased precipitation, floods, and rising sea levels. So leakage from the drinking water supply system is estimated at 30%. That's probably the highest in OECD countries. Water-scarce countries could not afford this type of losses. Now, we all know, of course, that Norway has lots of water, but this is no reason to waste so much of it. This could become a precious commodity in the future. The rate of improvement in infrastructure has been slow despite substantive investment, we welcome your efforts to create stronger incentive for upgrading water pipes through co-funding for municipalities and market operators. We also encourage you to further explore the potential for rationalization in the water and wastewater sector, including proposal on how municipalities could renew the pipe networks faster and in a cost-efficient manner. Another point, significant challenges remain to achieve a circular economy. This is an area where there's really scope for improvement. The population of Norway has one of the world's highest material consumption rates, a high material footprint per capita, and low material productivity. Only a small share of products is cycled back into the economy. And high material consumption with little recycling means a lot of waste. And in fact, despite ongoing efforts, Norway is not on track to decouple waste generation from economic growth, and a bit later there'll be some charts illustrating that. Municipal waste per capita is among the highest in Europe. Many waste reduction schemes are handled through voluntary agreements with industry, which do not always reflect the full cost of waste to society. So Norway has many opportunities to strengthen the regulatory framework and provide stronger incentives to change business models and help improving on that aspects. Moving towards a circular economy, of course, will need to involve behavioral changes. So it's more than just improvement in business models and technology. It's also going deeper and encourage change in behavior. And I know that the circular economy will be the focus of a conference here of the Nordic Council of Ministers in June. We really welcome this initiative and are keen to learn from the outcome of the discussion in the Nordic countries. Now, one area where more weight could be given to green measures is public support to the economy. There was a lot of public support for the economy in the worst phase of the pandemic, and of course, this was entirely appropriate given the nature of the shock. Now, this support included environmentally friendly measures such as investment in key infrastructure, increased funding in technology and development, and a green transition package, all good. But it also included substantial funds for the oil and gas industry and the aviation sector, which are less friendly to the environment. A system of tax concessions allow the immediate tax deductions of current projected investment spending in the petroleum sector all the way to 2028. Now, thanks to the rebound in oil prices following the recovery, a sharp rebound, concessions in the pandemic early months may, in retrospect, seem a little bit more generous than necessary. So policymakers can now turn more fully to structural challenges to enhance the resilience of the economy to multiple shocks, and this includes investing even more in measures to support the green transition. Another area where action needs to be pursued and amplified maybe is climate. Despite the economy-wide decarbonization efforts, Norway is still far from reaching its enhanced goal of cutting between 50 and 55% of emissions. On this, admittedly, there's some uncertainty regarding calculation methods of the effects of Norway's participation to the EU emission trading scheme. However, Norway will likely face a gap to achieve the 2030 emissions reduction target. We therefore encourage the government to accelerate the implementation of the Climate Action Plan 2130. While Norway does remain a climate mitigation and adaptation forerunner at home, it is also one of the world's largest energy exporters, thereby contributing indirectly to greenhouse gas emissions abroad. Obviously, the current geopolitical context and efforts to reduce European Union's reliance on Russian oil and natural gas also impact Norway. It may slow down the pace of Norway's transition away from oil and gas. However, this should not mean losing sight of the goal of achieving climate neutrality by 2030 and the longer-term vision of becoming a low-emission society by 2050. In any case, progress towards net zero ambitions in Europe will eventually bring down fossil fuel use over time, and Norway has all the capabilities and financial means to accelerate a just transition within its own borders and abroad. Finally, just a word on biodiversity. While Norway has one of the most diverse and pristine landscapes in Europe, trends in ecosystem status are unfavorable in many parts of the economy. Land use and land use change in forestry and agriculture, as well as for housing and roads, exerts major pressure on biodiversity. Nearly all threatened species are affected by factors related to land use in some way. The share of protected areas is expanding, but it's still incomplete, still has some gaps. So the OECD Environmental Performance Review recommends setting a specific timeline with appropriate funding for achieving national objectives regarding protection of representative or significant areas. So, in a nutshell, we encourage you to continue to play a pioneering and innovative role in environmental policy. You're doing well overall, there's no question about that, but we see scope for doing even more, better and faster. So let me stop here so as to allow time for discussion. I just want to take this opportunity to thank the Norwegian authorities for their support in preparing the review. This has been really, really helpful. We hope that our assessment and recommendation in supporting and the supporting analysis will provide useful guidance for future policy making. And we also hope that Norway's experience will inspire many OECD members and partner countries, and it is our role to communicate these lessons from these countries to other countries. Thank you for your attention. Minister, let me hand you the report.
Thank you very much.
It's a real pleasure.
Alan, thank you.
Good work.
Thank you to Alan Desser for, yeah.
Thank you.
Get the picture right.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much. I much appreciate this, and I much appreciated our meeting in Paris, the meeting we had on this, but also the environmental ministers meeting. And I want to start by really commending the very solid work that you have done here, but that the OECD is doing overall on this area. Once upon a time, the OECD was most known for suggesting deregulation of the labor market and so on. Those days are long gone. It's a very much stronger focus on equality and inclusion, but also on environmental practices, both climate and nature, biodiversity, the whole gamut. And I think that is really, really good. It helps us. I am very fond of peer reviews. I'm happy peer reviewing others, but I also happy to be peer reviewed by others. And I think that modern civilized industrial states benefit from being looked into and not always just telling their own story about what's going on. And I have to say, having read this and studied this in some detail, I have to say I think this is a very fair assessment. I agree with the scorecard, both when you say we're doing well, thank you, but also where you're saying we're not doing so well. Thank you for that too, because let's just quickly mention it. It is really important that we are a forerunner on carbon pricing. I'm fond of taxes. I think the right taxes changes behavior, and we both have a high level of carbon tax, but we also cover a broad scope, as you say, and we should be proud of that. And that is actually a collective merit, because this is widely supported in Parliament. It's not just this government. We basically inherited the ongoing climate plan from the former government, and there was massive support. And it's important to make that point clear, because regardless of who governs, the vast majority of parties supports a plan to increase the carbon tax to 2,000 kroners, which means right now 210 euros, I think. And we increased this year 28% to show very serious. It's not that it will happen at the end of the decade. It's happening linear, in real terms, linear growth, which signals to business that it will be increasingly expensive to emit. And of course, I also acknowledge, I'm happy for your recognition of our progress in electrification of transport. But what's most interesting for me to mention is that I think that we are given here a clear recommendation to do much better on circular economy. I agree. We are actually lagging behind, let's be frank about it. We're not doing very well. We're doing better than we used to, but others are doing much better than they used to. So we're lacking behind in relative terms to what many other countries are doing, and there is a clear scope for improvement. This is just to consume differently. I mean, we need to, of course, look at the total consumption, but it's basically about making incentives which makes it more attractive to use a product longer, to repair it rather than exchange it, and then to take the resources out and use them again. And interestingly, and I just a little mention here, is that this used to be kind of an idealistic idea. Then it turned into a business opportunity. And now it's even a security policy argument, because we're seeing sort of deep constraints in the global value chains, which means we cannot rely on always getting all these new materials over and over again. We have to be better at managing those we already have. So I agree with that. And I think also your recommendations on land use management are important. Our government is very adamant to combine two important instincts, which does not combine automatically. One of them is a stronger, stricter, clearer, more mature management of natural resources, land use change, and so on, and decentralization. Some people think they are at cross purposes. They don't need to be, because I think if you have a solid local ownership, and where you, as you say very correctly in the report, you help municipal administrations and regional administrations to be better at nature budgeting. You can have a better local ownership, a better understanding of why you are putting the restrictions you are, which are locally based and adapted to local circumstance, but which again delivers an overall positive improvement in our ability to do this. And in agriculture, I think also, I mean, my excellent colleague at the Agricultural Ministry and I are very adamant to also promote a more climate-friendly agricultural policy, more production of not only meat, which we also, because if we want to have sort of a solid percentage of Norwegian food on our tables, and new generations eat less meat anyway, regardless of what the government tells them to, they will do so in any case. We need to sort of increase the production of green stuff that can substitute all the meat production, but also with less phosphor and nitrogen-intensive agriculture use, where we are not good. Really, we are, as you say in the report, we are among the worst in over fertilization, for instance, of soil. So I think the whole package here is very important to take into account, and I just want to say thank you, because this is really useful. The last thing I want to mention is coordination. I very much see it as our role, as in my ministry, that we manage to work effectively across of course, all ministries at the government, that's the easier part, but also across sectors more widely, so that nature and climate is fully integrated in all kind of planning at any level, as it should be. And again, I think that's very much also the ethos of the 2022 edition of OECD and also this report.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Minister. I think your point on the circular economy and the connection to climate is very important, especially at the current juncture, as countries would like to increase the pace at which they sever their economy from fossil-based and trying to get away from Russian sources of gas. We see that in order to do that, we need far more productions of green technologies and equipment. And that in itself requires a number of critical materials that is itself not easy to access, or the production of which, the extraction of which is itself creating problems in terms of emissions. So if you allow me, before we open the floor for more questions, how do you see Norway's role in response to EU countries' search for alternative supplies of oil and gas in this current juncture? How can your country contribute to ensuring energy security at the same time without compromising the plans to build a common future without oil and gas?
That's really a key question, and we discussed it with the OECD. It's also a topic which IEA has very high on its agenda. How do you reconcile the short and medium term with the long term? And this is really important for Norwegians to understand. Right now, it's absolutely correct to send all the gas we can exploit to Europe. Everything we can send, because there is still, even if Europe's gas demand is going down in the long trend, they need to replace the Russian gas, so bring it on now, right? Yes. But the problem is that the other message is that in the longer run, sort of beyond medium range, the total imports will go down. So we simultaneously have to prepare for a future where the overall demand is much lower, and but by implication that the demand for alternatives are much higher. And I mean, then people think of the energy source. I mean, the less people want to use coal, oil, and gas, the more they need ocean wind and solar energy and so on. But you also need, for instance, batteries, because as cars move from, so the cars of the 21st century will run on batteries, as the 20th century cars run on diesel and petrol. We know that for a fact. The internal combustion engine is actually over. It doesn't know it yet, but the time is up. We just have to phase it out. But that means that there will be a very fast demand in batteries. We can actually produce batteries and battery technology, battery sources, mining for battery materials in Norway. But that, again, as you say, has to be done in an environmentally friendly way. And we have to design for circular economy even then. So to reconcile between, because in Norway we tend to have this debate between the schools saying let's just cut either production or at least any search for new oil and gas right now. That will solve the problem. And the other schools saying there will be an eternal demand. Both are wrong. I mean, the thing is we need to realign our long-term planning for energy, both fossil and modern, with the decarbonization plans of our biggest market, which is basically which is in the OECD, but it's basically yes. EU and the UK, which are our biggest markets, and that's really something we try to tackle in this energy plan that we just came up with. So it's an essential question. It's an essential question from an environmental perspective, but also for an economic, long-term economic solidity. Mm-hmm. Economic sustainability of Norway requires that we get this right, and we don't confuse short-term with long-term.
Absolutely. I'm now turning to the floor, see if we have some questions. Okay, go. Okay. I don't need a microphone. No. Oh.
Thank you. Minister, I would like to pick up on one point from Alain de Serres' comment, which is on the green recovery. At the OECD, we have a green recovery database where we have been identifying all the measures that countries have been taking place, and we have classified them like those that are green, those that are red, meaning not really helpful for the environment, and those that are mixed. And as Alain mentioned, you have done quite a green package. But in the red list, you have measures for the oil and gas sector that are really questioning us. And in the report, we see that there might be a really slowdown for the transition to the green economy from the implementation of these measures. And I'm having in mind the oil and gas tax deduction that goes up to, I think it's 2028. And quite some substantial also support on petroleum. So how do you see the reconciliation of this very generous and not so much for a green recovery when you go up to 2028?
That's a good question. Well, I first have to say, yeah, it's correct. Yes, you're right in that the effects will last for several years, but the actual package runs out this year, at the end of this year. But when you mention 2028, it's because projects that are starting now will have sort of be under this plan. But after this year, we will go back to a neutral tax regime. Actually, we have just agreed to introduce a more genuinely neutral tax regime for the oil sector from the time after this, meaning everything starting after next year. Will be what we call a neutral regime, which basically means that the state is not compensating for the risk that the private sector takes. There will be an equal share of risk. That's, in my own view, that's about time, but that's happening now. So that will be replace the current system, which was triggered by an impression in April 2020 that the oil price will go down towards zero, which of course was a short-lived presumption, as people will have noticed later, which triggered sort of a very broad agreement in Parliament that we needed to take some extraordinary measures. That's done. We recognize what you're saying, but in the long run, we are now preparing for an oil tax regime which is more, which I think is better attuned to the fact that most of the oil age, after all, is behind us rather than ahead of us, but there will still be a certain need. So I think that's the best answer we can give. But we recognize, we see what you read, and we understand.
Question from gentleman right there.
It's absolutely necessary now to stop giving out new petroleum licenses in Norway, and yet both the previous government and the present don't want to do anything about it. So what can the OECD do to nudge Norway towards stopping giving out new licenses?
Do you need new license? Oh, sorry. Do you need new license to accommodate this extra demand from in the short term?
Well, yes, because the actual, particularly when it comes to gas to Europe, we will need to extract some more. And ideally from near fields, from close to existing infrastructure. Otherwise, we will not be able to help Europe to compensate for the Russian fall. So I don't agree, but I don't agree with the premise that we're not doing anything, because we just said that we will from now on climate risk every new decision. So there will be we have now said that any new, what we call the PUD in Norway, which is a particular phase in the decision-making process, we will run a climate risk, which is economic climate risk. It's not a climate pose, but economic climate risk, which will, of course, then also take into account, as should be today, a 1.5-degree scenario. So that's a change which I think has been not sufficiently understood as a quite significant change.
Yes. Because my colleagues can correct me, but I think our recommendations land in the direction of avoiding, of course, opening new except when viewed as needed, like in this case. This is special circumstances. If it is substituting for other sources of gas, then the net effect on emissions doesn't need to be any net increase.
And I have to say, there's also, we actually believe that, we very much believe in the hydrogen economy. Yes. You can't run everything on batteries. You'll need hydrogen or ammonia for ships, for heavy transport, aviation, for industry, maybe aviation, yes. And clean hydrogen can be made either green or blue. In a perfect world, you would have abundant resource of electricity, and you can make it green, but that will take up all the electricity we can produce. So you will need, at least for a long phase, blue hydrogen. And if you crack the code, we know it works, but if you crack the code of the economics, you're making it, cheap enough, yes, then you should actually exploit more gas, because if that's transformed to blue hydrogen, you get a clean product that can replace other fossils, which still have emissions. So you have an emissions-free product, which is admittedly fossil because it comes from a fossil source, but without emissions. And that's one of the reasons that it's not so simple that you should just say stop any exploration.
We may have time for one. I'm keeping an eye on the clock because I know you need to leave. But maybe one more question.
Thank you. Christian Steele from Sabima. Norway is regarded as a frontrunner, but the report is not so commending on the biodiversity protection and land use planning. The director couldn't find any examples to list in his introduction from this sector. So I'm wondering, what are your comments on that, Minister?
My comment. As I said, this is on the critical side of the scorecard, and I agree with that too. As I said, I think we should do better. We are now working, and Sigrid Hagerup Mellus, my state secretary here, is now in charge of the ministry's work on developing a nature budget, where we will be evaluating nature risk, put the price on nature loss, and get a better data-based foundation for landscape planning, for instance, in order to avoid biodiversity loss, or at least reduce the most possible biodiversity loss, which is too high. And I was hinting at we want to do that combined with sort of an increased responsibility at the local level, which means that the municipalities, and that's also in the report, that you should help those authorities that matter to get this right. And are we getting it right today? No, we are not. I agree with you. And Christian Steele and Sabima is a strong voice for this in the media. And you're right, of course. We are not doing well enough. And we want to do better. And we will. So I recognize the challenge that comes from this report, which I think overlaps with what you have been saying for a while, Christian.
I think many of these issues will be discussed in the second panel, right? Yes, yes, in more detail. Maybe time for one last question. Oh, yes.
Thank you. My name is Pia Farstad von Hall from Biogas, the Norwegian Biogas Association, and you mentioned hydrogen, which is of course important, but there's an additional energy source which is important to develop. European Union is doing it at the moment, but what is the prospects for a Norwegian development in the biogas sector in order to be part of the energy sector in the future?
Whom do you ask?
Excuse me. If you, Espen, could, yeah.
Biogas is extremely important and definitely part of the package. I think it's particularly important that we try to. I think one thing we need to become much better at is to use the right energy for the right purpose, and because biomass is a limited resource. There's not a, I mean, we must use, I mean, for instance, if you can make biogas from waste management and from, you know, there's a lot of potential for using as part of the circular economy, and that's an absolute plus. It's only good news about it. If you cut down trees to make it's more problematic, right? So as long as we recognize the limited volume of available biomass, I'm all for it. And then it should be used for those sectors in transport, for instance, or industry where you cannot electrify directly. There's no reason to drive a personal car on biogas because it should all be battery. I mean, it's the most effective energy use. But there are certain buses and lorries, for instance, and maybe in the long run aircraft and so on, where biogas can be an important element. So just make sure we use it wisely. That's my answer.
The use of biomass in Norway, in the share of biomass in the total energy mix is actually very similar to what we see in the OECD on average. I'm not sure to what extent in many of the other countries they avoid the type of point you were making. If you cut trees to do biome, then you're creating a problem elsewhere. But it's very similar. So it's not that it's particularly low here. It's very in line and very similar to what we see on average with variety across countries, of course.
I will have to leave you because the government is meeting with the king. But I wish you.
Yes.
I would actually rather stay with you, but I can't. But I wish you a great seminar.
Yes, thank you very much, Minister.
Okay.
Nice to see you again. All right.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you, Minister. We are now moving on to the second part of the seminar, going more into depth of the report. This session will be moderated by Linda Nøstbakken, Research Director in Statistics Norway. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Also to those of you watching online. I'm very happy to be here and honored to moderate this session. I'm not going to take much of your time because we have little time and we have a lot of ground to cover, basically. As you heard in the opening session, the first chapter of the report, which this session is devoted to, covers a lot of different topics related to both the environment and climate policies. In this session, you will first get a presentation of the chapter by the main author from the OECD, Julia Van Giro. She's standing here waiting, so you can come join me. After Julia has given us a brief presentation of the report, or the first chapter of the report, we will have 3 prepared comments by what will then become the panel up here. And following that, you will also be invited to take part in the discussion. So keep that in mind so you can come up with, I would say, clever questions for the panelists here. and help me get this discussion going. So since we have a little time, without further ado, please, Julia. She's a policy analyst with the OECD, and she's the main author of Chapter 1. So who better to present this chapter? Go ahead.
Take that one. Okay. Well, thanks, Linda. Thanks for the introduction. I'm very pleased to be here with you today in Oslo, and I would also like to greet the team and colleagues and everybody else who is watching us on live stream today. I will present you some key findings from Chapter 1. As Linda just said, the coverage is rather broad. And if there's one key message that I would like to recall everybody today, that will be the following one. And it already came through during the introductory session this morning. I think overall, Norway is a front runner in many environmental areas, but there's still room for improvement, and notably to promote more sustainable consumption patterns. Now, let me start. The chapter is entitled Sustainable Towards Sustainable Development, and I thought a good starting point is to look at how far you have gone in implementing the SDGs. Maybe quickly recall that Norway has been #1 on the Human Development Index for nearly a decade, which is a quite impressive record. Now, if you look at your SDGs, you see a couple of 6 ones that are already fully achieved, 4 ones that are on track, but you also have a couple ones in orange and red. And interestingly, the red ones are all related to increasing environmental pressures, namely climate action, sustainable consumption patterns, and land use. We acknowledge that we think that Norway has done a rather good job in progressively mainstreaming implementation of the SDGs in sectoral policies. We think you could still do better in promoting policy coherence, moving from a goal-to-goal approach, away from it, to have a more holistic approach, and also, most importantly, stronger engage the local level at all levels of implementation. Air quality is overall good. As you can see on the chart, emissions have decreased over the past decade, with the exception of ammonia, that's the green line, and a recent increase on NMVOC, that's the black one. Norway has reached all its air emission targets. And this is also reflected in the air quality of Norwegian cities. You have 4 major cities that are all in the top 20 of the European City Air Quality Index. And I must say, nevertheless, there you see there's some temporary and localized pollution problems. That's very typical for Scandinavian countries. But we think when we look at your trends, that the air quality is set to improve over the coming years as you roll out many proactive measures like the EV policies, the urban growth agreements, etc. Now we have an interesting chart on water resources, and that was already mentioned this morning. On the left side, you see, first of all, Norway has a lot of water. You're in the top OECD countries for renewable resources per capita. In the middle, you see you also use a lot of water. You're also in the top 10 OECD countries of using water in terms of abstraction per capita. And on the right side, most interesting, you lose a lot of water. And that was that you have 30% that is leaking, and that's quite a lot. And as we said, it's not because you have a lot of water that you should waste it. And we acknowledge there was quite a bit of investment over the past decade to try to address this and to renew water infrastructure. But we think that progress is slow, and we welcome your efforts in trying to question what goes wrong and try to rationalize the management of the water sector. Now, when it comes to waste, let's maybe first acknowledge that you do have good waste management capacity. You have cutting-edge technology for waste sorting. Almost half of your municipal waste is treated by incineration with energy recovery, almost no landfills. So this is actually quite good if you compare to other OECD countries. Now, but we also see that waste is growing. And if you look at this chart, you see private households are actually part of that story. And no matter the difference in definition between countries, if you look at the big picture, Norwegians just produce much more waste than anybody else. For example, on average, a Norwegian produces more than 700 kilograms per year, while in Europe, it's more or less around 500. So you can see the difference. In short, you know how to manage waste, but you just produce too much of it. So there's definitely room for improvement. In the same vein, Norway has one of the world's highest material consumption rates, a high material footprint per capita, and low material productivity. And that's also in comparison with other Scandinavian countries. We welcome the fact that you now have your first ever circular economy strategy. We encourage you for a speedy implementation. I would also welcome a strong focus on global material footprints. And here we have a lot of interesting work going on within the OECD, and we think there will be a lot of opportunity for future cooperation. If we look at your energy mix, we see obviously your energy mix is much cleaner than the rest of the OECD, and that's notably thanks to your huge hydropower potential. But we also see that the share of wind power has been increasing very rapidly, and this creates also some tensions on land use, as we will see today in the second panel discussion, and also in relation to biodiversity issues and protection as regards offshore wind farms. Norway is energy self-sufficient. You're in a very lucky position. Many European countries would be jealous to be in your shoes, and you have become Europe's largest energy exporter. Now, climate action. And I know there's a lot of interest and appetite on the climate questions today. We have the panel debate on that. Let me first start by saying Norway is a small greenhouse gas emitter with absolute values, emission levels similar to other Nordic countries. In terms of emission intensity, Norway recorded one of the lowest levels in the OECD area. But if you now take into account emissions imported from imported goods, you have more than double and far above the OECD average. So here again, it's a matter of perspectives. You have decoupled emissions from GDP growth. You can see on the chart, the curve is rather flat, but there are important variations along the years. And if you compare 2010 to 2019, it's a 10% reduction. But if you compare back to the baseline to 1990, it's close to nothing. And just to recall, your ambition is to reduce emissions by 50 towards 55% by 2030. So we feel there's still a way to go. Obviously, this chart doesn't take into account emission trading, and we all know that emission trading will or has always played and will continue to play a major role. The climate measures that you're implementing are good and very broad-based, and this means that we expect a proportionate reductions in all sectors. And as a small and open economy, we also think that Norway's focus on national GHG emissions alone is maybe not enough, and that you should also consider imported emissions, exported emissions, and also foreign investment. And we make a couple of proposals on this in the report. Let me move on to decarbonized transport. Here you're clearly a leader, you're world leader. You had 2/3 of passenger vehicles sold in 21 that were fully electric. That's a world record. And this is an interesting chart. Besides all the progress you made, you see that the share of diesel and petrol is still quite high. And according to current projections, by 2030, you may have around 1.3 million electric cars. And that's just about half of your current car fleet. That means the whole change will take still several decades. And this is the problem. The growing demand for mobility has outpaced for a long time the decarbonizing of the transport sector. Instead of 2 cars, many Norwegians now have 3 or even 4 cars. And you understand that not quite solves the problem. So we think Norway needs to redouble efforts and make more structural changes to establish sustainable transport system. You also need to promote behavioral changes, shared mobility services, and an increased focus on mobility towards improved accessibility. Very quickly on the taxes, this is just to show that the overall level of green taxes has declined. We don't necessarily see that as a bad thing because it shows that actually you're very successful in reducing environmental harmful activities. You're kind of a victim of your own success. And that's why it's also a bit unfair to compare Norway with other countries, and we didn't do that. We also think that now as EVs are picking up very broadly, you could consider scaling back some of the very generous tax incentives for EVs. And most importantly, we think you should prioritize the preparation of a place-based road pricing system with tax rates depending on where and when the driving takes place. And this idea has been around for a while now. I look at Mr. Tom Radal, I know he's a fan of that. And I think you should just try to do it, and many OECD countries would be very interested in your experience. Very quickly on taxes, I think I can run through it. We always said you're a leader in carbon pricing. We commend Norway for having a long-term perspective. You have very high and broad rates and a solid tax system with annual adjustment. And as our peer reviewing colleague from Finland puts it, there's actually not much you can improve. Now, as we said on the green recovery, we think there are things you could improve. To be very fair, once again, your recovery has been greener than the recovery of many other OECD countries. But nevertheless, if you look at the amounts, we feel like at the beginning of the pandemic, it was obviously very important to secure the energy industry, etc. But in the end, the oil prices have now at a very high level. We feel that maybe, as already mentioned this morning, the support has been more generous than needed. A last slide, which is a bit word heavy, but it's a very important one. It's about the green transition. How can Norway accelerate a just and green transition? Well, first of all, we think you do have a lot of assets and you're very well positioned in accelerating your green transition. What will be important is the pace, because if you go fast, that wouldn't be a very good thing, because that might create important macroeconomic shocks, also impact on the employment, and that's a bit risky. But if you go too slow, there's also a risk that you never get there. So you need to get the right rhythm and find the right pace, and that means that it needs to be coordinated and planned. As a way forward, I would say it's very important to strengthen dialogue between government, private sector, and civil society. There's a lot of discussion underway, but quite separately and not necessarily connected. The private sector obviously plays a real important role, and there's a lot of discussion underway, and most of the big companies today, they all have sustainability goals, brochure, etc. What's important here is that it needs to trickle down at the implementation level. And that's still a challenge in Norway as everywhere else. Another thing is also, and that was mentioned, obviously you should avoid recreating the same structural changes and inequality patterns that you have in the oil industry. And that's already, and that came through during our peer review mission, it's happening that the new green industry also create already new inequality. And you need to find a way to try to avoid that. And the last point is, please don't lose sight of long-term goals. And that was nicely explained by the minister, that you need to distinguish between the urgent short-term needs without losing track of your long-term goal of becoming climate neutral by 2030 and a low-carbon society by 2050. We think you absolutely have everything you need to move forward. So we encourage you to continue on the path towards green growth. And I'm done with the thematic presentation, maybe quickly encouraging you to read the full report. It's much broader. It has many more key messages and a lot of nice recommendations, hopefully helpful. If you don't have time, you can take a look at the highlights brochure, which is a more visual project and presenting some of the key messages. It will be available hopefully next week in Norwegian as well. And now, if you have more appetite for key environmental trends, I encourage you to check out our brand new online country profile. You have the web link here. Here we have interactive charts. You can explore the data, you can play with the data, you can compare your country with other countries. It's really a very great tool. Please check it out. It's very nice. And that's it. Thank you very much for your attention. And I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much. I think you can take a little break and sit down, and then we will invite you back up on stage later on. So this takes us to the discussion part, right? We had the presentation. So we will, to stimulate this, we have three people who have prepared comments. They represent different perspectives, at least that's what you would think. We have someone representing an environmental NGO, we have someone from the oil and gas and energy sector, and we have the research community. So they've been challenged to bring in some perspectives on the reports and the recommendations from their own perspectives and the context of their own work and research. The first comment will be given by Benedicte Solås, so please come join me. Benedicte is the Director of Climate and Environment at the Norwegian Oil and Gas Association. So you have the floor, please. Okay.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the OECD and Julia for a very interesting and good presentation of the report. I would like to start with to say that I'm happy to see that the OECD acknowledges that the Norwegian petroleum industry has comparatively high environmental standards and climate standards. And you also say that there are a lot of companies having set net zero targets. Well, in fact, the whole industry, the oil and gas industry in Norway, has jointly set climate targets for 2030 and 2050. So for 2030, we aim to reduce emissions by 40%. That target was upped by the Parliament last year to 50%. And for 2050, we aim to come to close to zero. So this will be vital for industry to reduce their emissions if Norway are to reach their climate targets, as the emissions from industry represent about 1/4 of the total emissions in Norway. So we're working systematically to reduce our emissions in industry. We report on this annually. Our next report will be presented in May, June. But we're also working on developing new value chains which will not only reduce emissions in our own sector, but also in other industries. That being offshore wind, producing hydrogen from natural gas with CCS, ammonia as an alternative fuel, and obviously carbon capture and storage in itself. So I'm happy to see that you also acknowledged the progress done on the Longship project, which was mentioned here as well. Where our member companies are essential in developing this project with their competence and technology, and taking it further to industrialize it so that we can build a new industry on this in Norway. So finally, I know that you, as you said, Norway has a way to go towards achieving a circular economy. And to that, I am pleased to say that also the oil and gas industry now has this high on the agenda. I could have given you an example, but I'll save that. I see that time is running up, so I'll save that for the discussion. But it is really something that is high on the agenda in industry as well. So thank you.
Very good. I think we will have a lot to discuss later on. So. Just keep thinking about what you want to ask. The next speaker, or who will give comments, is Taran Fehn. Taran is a senior researcher at Statistics Norway, so she's a colleague of mine. She's also affiliated with CICERO, partly because she heads a big research project on climate policies and effective climate policies. So this should give a good starting point to give some comments on this. So please, Taran.
Thank you very much, Linda. So as a starting point, I will use one of the slides that Julia presented, which had a title, GHG emissions are close to 1990 levels. Apparently, that's a very sad message. However, it reflects that Norway's climate targets allow for buying quotas abroad. And until 2020, we bought quotas in the European ETS market, and also cheaper, more low-quality CDM offsets from developing countries. The 2030 targets of Norway are to be met in close cooperation with the EU, where cheap offsets are banned. So, on the other hand, by this close relationship with the EU, we get more flexibility options within that system, both across non-ETS and ETS-covered emissions and across countries. So flexibility can be said to be a main motivation for making this close cooperation with the EU. However, recently, the new government has launched the ambitions of not leaning on the EU flexibilities. All abatement is to take place within Norwegian borders, also the ETS-covered emissions. And this is radical, and it will increase costs substantially. And this new goal is not addressed in a report, and that is natural because it's very new. It implies, for instance, what Benedicte already told us about, that ETS-covered oil and gas will find it profitable to electrify their installations. And this is a very expensive climate policy. Moreover, the cost will partly fall on the government and the rest of the society because of policies. Because we have, lenient licensing practice, we have public funding and a tax regime, which we have already talked about, that leads to overinvestment. So from a societal perspective, it would be better to substitute some of the reductions in the emissions per volume extracted with volume reductions in that sector. And that is partly because 95% of the emissions from those volumes take place in other countries. And also, since the industry will have to reduce their productions anyway in the near future. And we see that the report has some recommendations in that vein. And for example, they urge us to develop an action plan for the transition from fossil fuel production. And such plans for Norway, I think, will be very visible internationally and could inspire other producers. So to wrap up, the higher ambitions within borders look impressive, but abatement will not increase, but merely move from the EU to Norway, and it will have considerable extra costs. So, and last but not least, we can risk that the motivation for cooperating with the EU will be weakened, and our commitments will be weakened then, and policy credibility will be weakened then, and in the worst case, we could end up buying the cheaper, lower quality offsets as before.
Thank you. I can imagine that some would like to respond to some of this, but we'll save that till we've heard Caroline Ander, who is director, the World Wide Fund for Nature, WWF. So please, Caroline.
Thank you for that, and thank you for the opportunity to comment on this report. And I think in some aspect, this report can have been written by WWF or another environmental organization, because it actually states what we have said for a long time, and what we know is that we do have high ambitions, we do set goals, but we struggle to achieve them. And we are not willing to take the key actions we actually need that we know to do in order to go through a green and just transitions of Norway. So I'm here to comment on mainly that point, and we'll leave the nature part for later speakers. But I think the report is quite clear on that we have to really commit to a just and green transition by speeding up the processes. The Minister of Environment and Climate was already challenged on what we do with the oil and gas industry in that aspect. And I think that is the debate we need to continue to have, because we can't kind of say that we will do a green transition in one direction, have some investment there, doing new policies there, and at the same time continue down the road of having a very oil and gas dependent economy, where we actually now currently are locking in investments way beyond 2050. Because when we talk about the oil tax regime that came in 2020 due to the pandemic, as mentioned already here, is being too generous, it was to stimulate more oil and gas activity. That can make sense maybe from an economy point of view when you're an oil and gas dependent economy, but it doesn't make sense if you're going to reach our climate target, not just in Norway, but also abroad. So I'm really happy that the report is also challenging Norway, that we shouldn't just look at the emissions here we have in Norway, but how our oil and gas export is actually contributing to more emissions globally. And it's not just me who says this. I've said this for many, many years. It's the UN General Secretariat saying we can't have new oil and gas licenses. It's the EA, the International Energy Agency, is saying it. And OECD is also now pointing on that we can't continue down what we have done before. And I am not speaking of closing down the oil and gas industry tomorrow. Nobody actually are here in Norway, but we are talking about what do we do investments and where do we see ourselves after 2030 when we are not supposed to have, when we are going to be climate neutral as pointed to here, and also halving our climate emissions globally. Because if we do investments in oil and gas, search for a new oil and gas field now and do the licensing, these are not come into production way beyond 2030 and it's going to produce way beyond 2050. That is not just doable. So I'm happy to conclude, I'm happy that the report is pointing to what we already know. And then I'm really hoping that this report, the Prime Minister for Norway, not just the oil and gas minister, that the finance minister, take this report to every meeting they attend with the king, to their budget conferences for the government meeting and saying, this is how we perform, what do we do about it? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Please come on, join me on stage, Julia and the rest of the panel. And thank you so much for quick, but I would say filled with quite a lot of content. I think you gave us more than enough to discuss in this next half hour, not even that. What I noticed is I started opening up the session by saying that this chapter is very broad. It covers a lot of topics, but you all quickly took us down into the oil and gas sector. But I would like to take a little step back because I'm sure we're going to go back there. We saw Julia presenting in the beginning here how Norway has a high ambition when it comes to, I would say, anything related to the environment, but also climate policy and climate targets. You also said there is still a way to go, right? So I'd like to just very quickly, while you guys out there think about clever questions to ask, if you were to, if you could, what would you like to see in a future climate plan from the government? You challenge them now. What would you bring? Give me one or two measures that should be key in such a plan from the government in the future. Benedicte can start.
Yeah, thank you. The government just proposed a new message to the parliament, I think. I'm not sure the Norwegian word. Anyway, where they speak about offshore wind, for example. And that is one area where we, as an association, we think that the Norwegian government is lagging behind because we are losing in the competition with our European colleagues. Even Germany, not even Germany, but Germany, UK, Denmark, sorry, has set very ambitious targets to how much offshore wind they want to produce, whereas we in Norway we're in this little other post. We're not even mentioned in the European context. So we would encourage the Norwegian government to step up their ambitions, do it more quickly, and realize this industrial initiative as fast as possible. Yeah.
Thank you. Carolina.
I think the main point is for Norway to make a holistic just green transition plan, which includes the oil and gas as part of it, which includes other industries with emissions and high impact on nature, because that's what we're lacking. We don't have that kind of holistic ambitions on where we go in a future that is green, where the oil and gas industry is part of the transition with its competence, world-leading competence, and people working there that we can provide jobs for in another industry. And it was mentioned on waste and so on, but the talk about circular economy, we haven't almost talked about that in Norway for many years. There has been different messaging here and there, and the minister also admittedly said there we have a long way to go. So how can we make the circular economy as where we want to go, moving away from a linear economy, making sure that we have more nature and less emissions, and doing that transition in a good way for Norway. So that plan and having the other politicians, political parties to agree on this is the direction we want to go, and that impact our state budget. Where do we make our investments? Because that's the key challenge now for us, I think, for Norway. We have high ambitions and then real practice in politics and investments is not supporting the ambitions.
Thanks. Taran.
Thank you. Yes, if I want to compare with the current plan that the previous government made, we need to be even more stringent because we have already now increased our ambitions or our goals, commitments. Second, I would put even more emphasis on pricing, CO2 pricing. We are acknowledged in your report for having high taxes, but they are far from high enough. In the computations we made in Statistics Norway, we found about the double of this price was necessary for reaching the goals we have. So in the same vein, avoid exemptions from those taxes and rebates from those taxes, and also avoid reducing, for example, the road use tax to compensate for the higher CO2 tax, because then we will be left with no impact at all. Yes, another point is that I find very little in the current plan and also in the OECD report about agricultural abatement. So that is where I would have wished more. Yes.
So can I just, if you have a short comment, that's fine.
Yeah, no, it's just taxes in general, green tax reform. We need that in Norway that really addresses the different taxes and subsidies, which is mentioned in the report as well, across. So I think that's also a key thing for us to do.
Yeah. I was actually going to ask you a specific question, Julia, but maybe I'll do that too, and then you can also comment on what's been said, because you say in your report that maybe too many of the measures are aimed at technology. So getting the right technology, and that we should also raise the focus on changing behavior and consumption patterns, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know if you have a comment on...
That's true, and that's maybe one also of my personal message. When we ask about green transition, the first reaction was always a discussion on technology. And when I think about green transition, I think much more on a broader society-wide change that needs to happen. And very often when we also discuss how is that Norway has such a big material footprint, etc., everybody says, oh, it's normal, it's a rich country, you have a lot of consumption. But I think this is not the right way to see it, because it's exactly because you have the means that you have much more option to try to reduce your environmental impact. But I would like to quickly rebound on what Taran just said, and I'm glad she put it forward, because I had exactly the same point. If you are to further reduce GHG emissions, I think the first thing is you already have a lot of policy measures around, and the very first important thing is that they're very broad and economy-wide. And I totally agree that you should stick to it and implement it, and with little exception as possible. And if you need them, then really try to think, is it really necessary? Can we make it time-bound? Don't make it structural. Because if you start shielding specific groups from these measures, you actually remove the price signal that you intend to place. And it's very important that these measures are given with a long-term perspective, what you do, and that they are being implemented. And if you manage to implement the gradual increase of the carbon price as scheduled, that's already a very big step and quite exceptional in the OECD area. Now, for circular economy, we agree that there is a way to go, and I think the first thing to do is to put it back into the political debate, and this seems to be happening and confirmed by all three speakers. Thank you.
Taran.
Yes, and of course I think justice is one motivation for making different taxes for different actors, but there are actually many other ways of compensating those who are unfairly affected. Yeah.
So I did say that I would bring you guys into the discussion, so maybe I should see if anyone has a question at this stage. Yes, we have one here. Maybe let's get a mic, and if you could also introduce yourself, then that would be great.
Thank you. Annabeth Skrede from LO, Norwegian Confederation of Trade Unions. A question to OECD, because you were saying something about that we should count and also be responsible for both, not only national emissions, but also exported emissions and imported emissions. And that's fine, but that means that every country should do the same. And how should we count? And that is one of the major dilemmas in the UNFCCC area and the Paris Agreement rule book on how to count all the emissions. And now they've finally agreed on how to do it. But then you want us to do something else. Can you please elaborate on that? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, a very good question. And I want to clarify, I didn't say you should account them. I said you should broaden up and consider them and have a stronger focus on global footprints in general, global carbon footprints, but also global material footprints. And that was actually a lot of discussion when we wrote the report, because that was a bit of a controversial part. We think that the idea of global material footprints is getting more and more accepted. And I think when it comes to carbon footprints, there's still a way to go. And obviously it's a tricky one, and we can't ask Norway to account for it if everybody else doesn't. And we clearly stated also in the report, obviously Norway is not responsible for emissions produced abroad. Now, as you're a small open economy, we're in an interconnected world. It makes total sense to also think about the impact that you produce through your daily actions. And that's related to emissions embedded in the products that you consume. And we have nice charts on the country profiles. I really invite you to explore the online country profiles, where we can see that if you look at carbon intensity, it's very low. But if you factor in everything imported, it's quite high. So here it's just a matter of trying to get focus on it. We're not yet at the stage where we have the accounting ready. And as you said, there is no international agreement. What we ask at this stage is to keep it in mind, and that your actions in an interconnected world do have an impact. So you can't ignore them totally. But we do acknowledge when it comes to accounting within the UNFCCC Paris Agreement process, this is nothing that at the moment is accounted, and it's clearly stated in the report. Thank you.
We have two people who wanted to comment on this. Actually, we have three. So, Carolina, start.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good question, and I think that's what's missing from the Norwegian debate. Because when we talk about the oil and gas industry in Norway, we love to talk about it as a national thing when looking at the emissions from the production side, and not talk about the exports and the use of it where the emissions actually happen. In other fields, we're really happy to talk about global context and a national impact and so on, but it doesn't affect us that much. So I think we have to change the narrative, and we have to change the debate that we are responsible for producing this and giving it to some others and saying, well, you use it, we sell it for somebody to use. So we sell it for emissions to go up, continue from the oil and gas sector, and that we can't continue with. That said, doesn't mean that we're closing down tomorrow and not going to don't use the competence and don't use the workers in that industry. That's the transition that we have to go through, and we can't do that before we join those discussions together and don't have one separate oil and gas debate and one climate debate, which we currently have.
Now we are joining it, though. I should just say that. So this is why we now can move from the WWF to the Oil and Gas Association to address the same question.
Yeah, so first of all, I'm not sure I agree that we have two separate debates, because the oil and gas industry does actually, as I mentioned in my introduction, we do have focus on developing new value chains that will contribute to reduce emissions from the products that we export. For example, if we are exporting hydrogen produced from natural gas with CCS, it will be the carbon footprint when used in Europe will be close to nothing, as opposed to exporting just the natural gas, if you wish. So I do mean that we have this discussion parallel. And to Elo, sorry, I couldn't remember your name. I just wanted to comment also that for the oil and gas industry, we are actually paying a lot more attention now to the so-called Scope 3 emissions. So we have reports on identifying how companies are working with the Scope 3 emissions, identifying what our suppliers are doing, what are their emissions to producing the steel and whatever. From that to also counting the emissions from business travel. So this is increasingly also on the agenda in the oil and gas industry. That being said, I agree that it's hard to create a global system to account for this, but yeah.
Maybe just a very small addition. We also have some concrete proposals, recommendation as regards foreign investment beyond imported and exported emission. This is a good example where Norway actually can have a lot of impact because we suggest, and this is actually already underway, that you follow through the recommendation of an expert panel that the investment of the pension fund should be aligned with the goals of the climate of the Paris Agreement. And the equity portfolio at the moment has twice as much emissions as Norway as a country. So there's where you see that Norway can actually have a very big impact while focusing on things that go beyond your national borders.
Yeah. Taram.
Yes, I'd just point out that there are good reasons for choosing the territorial principle that the UNFCCC has done, because it's much easier both to measure and to monitor. But that doesn't mean that we will not learn from trying to see the patterns from other angles. So I do welcome that we try to make different accounts and to learn from that. But it's also very uncertain how to count in other ways. We have to lean on averages instead of marginal effects, which would be the most right thing to do. So, it's also very difficult to make policies out of this. But it's not impossible. It is done. For example, the EU has now introduced the idea of CBAM, having tariffs on imported emissions. There is also regulations, certificates for biofuels, for example, that can be done. And as you also said, investing abroad in cleaner products is one way of following up by policies. Yeah.
Thanks. Did we have other questions from the audience? Yes, we have a first row.
It's not really a question, it's just to complement some of the answer, to inform you that at the OECD we have pioneer methodology for calculating imported emissions embedded in trade and in final domestic demand. And we are working on it to update it more to the recent numbers, because now we have it until 2018, and we understand that many countries are having the same debate as you are having here, and we hope to be able to have 2019 by June, and if we're lucky, 2020 maybe by the end of the year. But beyond this methodology that I think is well recognized and that I would encourage you to have a look at, we are also working on other methodology for material flow and for other indicators that are related to just broader than CO2 emissions embodied in trade. So there is a program that is called the International Program for Action on Climate, which divides a group of highly specialized technicians and statistical people from Environment Ministry and from statistical offices to discuss what would be the best indicators to help follow the commitment of countries towards their own objectives. So if you are interested, we can also put you in touch with these people.
Perfect. Thank you. I'd like to, Benedict, you mentioned that you would maybe return to something in the discussion, and this was your efforts towards a circular economy in the energy sector. So maybe I'll give you a little bit of time to go a little bit into that, since this is a big topic that Norway's, was we learned today, performing under par, should we say?
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to provide you with an example on how industry is working with this, because this is also increasingly on the agenda. Because industry sees it's profitable for climate, but not, but also money to save here. So, for example, when the wells are permanently plugged, we withdraw approximately 4,000 meters of pipes from each well. that are sent to cleaning, and then so that they are clean and ready to be melted down and reused again. So this is increasingly happening. That is, well, to permanently plugged wells, but it's increasingly happening reusing steel, for example, for the constructions offshore, etc. So I am very happy that it is on the agenda and that we are contributing to putting this on the agenda as well.
Yeah. So is there anything the government could do to stimulate this, to change behavior, but then not just my behavior, but company and industry's behavior? I don't know, Carolina, if you...
If there was political will for it. So I think one of the key things, which is not just relevant for Norway, but for example, the whole of EU, is to set kind of guidelines and measures to, for example, how do you design a product in order to count how can you repair it, or you have to dispose it after a certain time of use. Here in Norway, you can look at the taxes and see kind of how is it. Can we make it more incentives to actually go to with a product that is kind of damaged to get it fixed instead of buying something new, how we deposit things. And particularly in waste management, there has been a lot of talks about that for years in Norway, have to resolve it. And we have this intricate municipality system who have different systems for how, for example, we recirculate plastic in Norway, even though we are quite a small country, only kind of not that many people. We're a small city in many places in the world. But so it's a matter of political will to actually see how can we make this incentives and putting demands on it. And I think so far it's been looking to the industry to being two voluntary measures. So the industry can do it, and they do it from a voluntary base, but we have to get this systemic change in thinking how do we integrate it in political frameworks, directives, and making sure that it's for end consumer doesn't have to take every choice, but the offers that is provided, and maybe some offers shouldn't be allowed. So for example, 3 for 2, when you kind of are you want the company is trying to buy more than we need, which leads to, particular in food, to food waste. How that shouldn't be allowed. It's very simple. That is not allowed. You can set down the prices, you can have different offers, but you shouldn't stimulate overconsumption. That shouldn't be allowed. It's very easy if there is political will. And I don't think anybody would miss it. When I grew up, we didn't have that offer. It's something that has come. We won't miss it even. So I think it's sometimes actually a small thing can actually make a huge impact. So it's a matter of having these discussions now. And as I said, take this report in every government conference and every political meeting and use that as a way to see kind of we can actually do quite a lot if we want to. And I don't think there will be a lot of kind of pushbacks from people even or the public either.
Maybe it's also changing our minds, the way we think about this, just to be more conscious also as consumers.
Yeah, and needs to be nudged.
Yeah.
So then, and I talking about in the companies, or if you go to a supermarket in Norway, before you had sweets and candies right next to the cashier where you buy things. Now it's fruits and vegetable. It's nudging. So it was much easier for people to just take a chocolate. They can't do that. Now they have to go to the chocolate shelf to take it. Now there's carrots there. So maybe somebody in the beginning was the opposite to do, but you're actually not missing that chocolate that you took with it just at the end.
This is why I'm now eating so many carrots.
I
didn't know. Okay, but Julia, you raised your hand.
I'm actually going to hire you to promote the report for us.
But
this is great, but I totally agree. And I think part of it is to do also that a lot of the management is at the moment trusted to voluntary agreements. And voluntary agreements can work, but they work best if there's a threat for regulatory arrangements. And I think in some cases maybe this threat is not big enough. And for instance, food waste. You have a great voluntary agreement with 15 different industry organizations, and that contributed to reduce food waste by about 10% for over 5 years. But I think the goal was 15, so you're below. And I think it's just not acceptable that we still throw so much food. And I think that's an idea that is easy to be picked up by everyday ordinary citizens as well. It's a matter of getting it done.
I think this was it. So we don't have any more time, but I think this was a good way to end the session. So thank you so much to those of you contributing on stage and also for joining in from the audience. So I'll give me a round of applause.
Thank you.
I should now say that it's 11:30. We will take a 10-minute break. I encourage you to go out, stretch your legs, get some coffee. If you're watching from home, you can probably eat carrots. But we will be back here at 11:40. Yeah.
Please take your seats. We are 2 minutes late. That's not much, but that's 2 minutes. We are now moving to the next session with a special topic we had for this report, land use and biodiversity management. This session will be moderated by Per Stålnake, his research director at, now I have to read, Norwegian Institute of Bioeconomy Research. So, Per.
Thank you very much. We will have the same procedure as in chapter 1 or just before the coffee break. So we will have a chapter introduction made by Roger at OECD, and then we will continue with prepared comments. We have 3 distinguished experts, which each will give a 3-minute expert comment. And then we will have the same panel discussion, and we are also opening for questions from the audience. So first out, we have Roger Martini, who is the senior policy analyst at OECD, which he has been there since 2002, I read on LinkedIn. And you have your special field of area in collecting and analyzing policy data in both agriculture and fishery as your main field. So we are very much looking forward to the Chapter 2 presentation. So the floor is yours, Roger.
Thank you very much, Per, and hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today with us. Now, the Norwegian government, when we had this when we first set out this project, they asked us to take a special look at this question of land use planning, and the land use management system. So when we looked at the biodiversity and landscape management situation in Norway, we tried to take a very careful lens and produce recommendations that are along that line. So, so you'll see in the presentation today, you know, we talk about some broader issues, but the recommendations really focus down on this planning system. And we have to be a bit humble because we know planning systems are complex and they're detailed and they're legalistic. And it's impossible for us at the OECD to become experts at that immediately. So I'm really happy to see that the panel today is composed of people who know much more about this than I do. And I'm really anxious to hear their views about where we got it right, where we maybe missed some points, and to really work together in the discussion to kind of get a more complete understanding about what's going on and how Norway can do. So that's great. Now, before I start, I'm going to tell you my whole presentation up front, so you can think about whether you think I'm right or not while I'm talking. So the idea is that Norway's doing a lot. They're doing really well at a lot of things, but the results on the ground are disappointing. Now, why is that? You know, and that's the question we're going to be trying to answer today. So, as I said, Norway's made really good progress on a lot of things. The Nature for Life Biodiversity Action Plan, I think, is a really, really well-constructed, well-conceived document that sets out good objectives and good mechanisms to get to the objectives for biodiversity conservation in Norway. It's one of the reasons why this was really such a delightful project to work on for me, is that the Norwegian administration is very good at analysis. Producing, sharing, disseminating analysis. It's really quite something to see as an outsider, how, you know, the white paper system and all this stuff, how really it works really well. Now, that very good thinking on the part of the government has been matched by a lot of investment in information collection. The Nature Index for Norway, I brought up here as an example, but there's lots of really good examples of Norway collecting data and analyzing it in a really constructive way. And the next big piece of the system, I think, is the county governor system, which has really evolved quite strongly from sort of an oversight evaluation role into something that is much more collaborative to help municipalities more and provide guidance along the system. They've also, the government has provided some clarified advice to the county governors to help them do their job better. There's this circular T216, I think it's called, that really sets out, here's what the issues are for county governors. So big improvements in the system. It's just, you know, I'm going to hammer on this point a little bit with a few more things. You know, marine management plans are first rate in Norway and recently updated. The quality norms is something that's also been anticipated, and the framework has been developed, and now there's in place for reindeer and salmon and maybe more things. It's a really, really, I think, a nice and important approach that's being taken there. A lot of work being done to identify and prioritize areas for further protection in Norway, and a really, I think, quite good implementation of the Water Framework Directive that I think also has a lot of lessons for how you can have a multi-tier, multi-government, multi-stakeholder collaboration process that works to deliver outcomes. So now that's all on sort of the infrastructure of government side, but Norway is committing more money to these problems, a lot more money for protection of forest areas, protected areas, threatened species, natural heritage, water management. We see the budget's up a lot from 2013, up substantially in some cases. So we see a real commitment on the part of the government to put more really on the ground in this way. So that's the good part, right? Like a lot of it is happening there. But now let's look at what's happening on the trends of the situation on the ground as we see it. Now, the red list of threatened species, it's getting longer, there's more species on it, and it's getting redder. The more species are in higher classifications. Now, this graph is showing the change from 2015 to 21. The change from 2010 to 2015 tells much the same story. Maybe it's even degraded a bit from 15 to 21 relative to the previous period. So the situation with respect to species is, most generous you can call it, is static. Same thing at the ecosystem level. We have here the Nature Index for Norway results between 13 and 19, and we see that there's some good news, there's some bad news, but mostly it's a pretty static story. Now, what else? Big decline in farmland bird populations. I think Norway has one of the steepest declines in the index for bird numbers on farmland among the OECD, and we see it's quite a steady decline. And finally, in agriculture as well, nutrient surpluses, they're improving, but they're still among the highest in the OECD in terms of surpluses. And agriculture is a bit my thing, and we're not going to get into it too much today, but I heard a few mentions of agriculture around. So if someone wants to go there, we can have a discussion about why this might be the way it is. But so anyhow, so that's the basic story. Now you might be saying at this point, okay, Roger, change happens slowly for the environment. It takes some time for these things to happen. Maybe we just need to wait. And these indicators, the red list, the everything else, will be improving as a result of this policy effort. And that's maybe, right? So now let's look at some of the pressures that are on the system and see if we can maybe try to elaborate our diagnostic a little bit. So one of the clear messages that comes out of this Nature Index for Norway is that the land use change is really a big part of the story of ecosystem pressures. Climate's getting important, pollution's there as well, but land use change is really touching significantly on every, nearly for every threatened species, land use is part of the problem. We see as well that there's a lot of development pressure in Norway. Here we have an index of secondary homes, and we see that the projections for new construction of secondary homes is quite steady into the future. And I'm not saying that this is the problem. Like this is by far from being the only development pressure in Norway. There's industry, there's business, there's infrastructure like windmills, things like that are also a very big part of the story. But this is just to say that the economy doesn't stop, right? And there's always this demand and increase that's continuing. And we see in point of fact that where the threatened species, they're more or less where the people are, and in semi-natural areas, which means agriculture in a certain way, or where humans have had an impact on the natural footprint. So, and finally, we see again, where's the need for more protection? It's in the south. It's where the people are. It's where where that activity of the economy encounters and interacts with nature. So those are basically the story of where the pressures are lying and why things may be the way they are. So let's try to draw this now into the story of the planning system. And here are some of our recommendations. Now, in the past, I think Norway has recognized that if you have sort of a static and really rigid focus on national objectives, you just create tension and conflict between the government and citizens and between municipalities. But you have to do a good job of making your objectives something that can be understood and communicated and measured, and that's why we think smart objectives are really important for that. Now, what you can do if you do that, and all this wonderful investment that I mentioned at the outset in measuring and understanding ecosystems, put that information down into the planning process. So you have something more to work with than the opinion, the advice of the county governor. You have numbers, you have metrics, and then you make sure the incentives are right. You know, and nothing's worse than an unfunded mandate for lack of success. Now, you have to respect the polluter pay principle. That's really important. But if the government is seeking to achieve results through the mechanism of other communities, they have to sort of accompany them on that path. And that's a word I think I'll be returning to a few times, is how to do that accompaniment. And part of that is finding constructive ways to deal with conflict, how to resolve problems. I think one of the things that the government's been trying to do recently in planning is try to turn down the temperature a little bit and to avoid some of the conflicts that have been problematic. And the risk, if you just sort of look at conflict as the problem, is that you sort of give up on your national objectives, and that's not good either. So you have to find some way to take in criticism, to deal with it constructively, and to produce a solution that works for everyone. And one way to do that is to involve the whole community. One of the things that struck me is the sort of the conception of devolution of power in Norway is very much about the local government. It's not so much about the local people. And so the mechanisms of consultation are there, but they could be stronger. The efforts the government makes to reach out and involve more people in the discussion could be more effective. So really, this is the point I'm trying to make to you in a nutshell, what I asked you to think about and see if you agree. You want a national government that has objectives that are clear, but can find a way to share them with municipal governments in a way that the municipal governments agree. So there's some room for negotiation there. There's some room for discussion and education. And then the national government works together with the municipal governments to find the solutions to achieve the objectives. So that's, broadly speaking, very easy for me to say. I'm very hopeful that my panelists will help me to find out exactly how that might be done in reality. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Roger, for this nice overview with a quite clear message and recommendations for us. So we will start now with the comments from three panelists. So we will start off with Kjetil. Oh, I lost the paper here. Sorry. Kjetil Bjørklund. He is a specialist manager on climate in KS, or the Norwegian Association for Local and Regional Authorities, since 2008. And you have also been member of the parliament from 2001 to 2005, and also been a political advisor for the Ministry of Environment from 2005 to 2006. And you are also chairman of the board for Dokka Delta Wetlands Center since 2009, which has, among other things, worked with NIN mapping. So the floor is yours. 3 minutes, please.
Thank you. Firstly, I will also congratulate Roger and the others in OECD with this interesting review. We need your eyes looking upon us from another perspective than we have when we look through our daily work each day with our mindset. We need that frank view from our friends, and we got it through this report. And there are certainly some interesting findings here. I could underline all of the recommendations in this report. It fits well together with several R&D projects which we have run and are running in our own organization about land use and circular economy. And we are now working with a project which is delivering 10th of May, which is called Sustainable Land Use within the frame of local democracy, which is have a great overlap with this. I have mainly been working with climate issues in COAS for nearly 2 decades now, and I have seen how the work in the municipalities and counties have moved forward from climate and energy actions plans with relatively simple energy measures to combined strategies with complex chains of actions for transforming municipalities towards a low emission society. And for most of our municipalities, with the plans and measures integrated now in the ordinary budgets. And the collaboration and the cooperation between the decisions made in national, regional and local level has improved the last years. And there's a lot to learn from this when we have to look through our strategies for how we can strengthen our land and land use policies and tools to create better conditions for the biodiversity and the ecosystems in all national, regional and local decisions. The last international reports have shown us that we have to deal with both a climate and a nature crisis, and that we have to act fast to avoid the worst scenarios for our future. We cannot work with only one of these challenges. We have to work with both at the same time. The good news is, as already told, that Norway is a democracy. We have a high level of trust from the people in the country. We have a system for governance with high level of confidence. We have an advanced welfare system that can ensure just transition. And we have money in the bank, as a former Minister of the Treasuries referred to some years ago. That gives us strength and possibilities to do an even better job for our common future. In this report, we can read that Norway has increased efforts, but this has not led to dramatic improvements, as you said. And this is, of course, alarming. But the answer is that we need to make more decisions that avoids loss of biodiversity. Our municipalities have, through the Planning and Building Act, right to plan the land use and development in their society, in their municipalities, and they do make a lot of plans. Plans are often made to ensure that people in the municipalities get education, healthcare, a place to build a house, a place to build a secondary home, a safe road, water and wastewater system, shops and business development. A lot of this needs is to be placed somewhere, and the land use is the main issue here. And how can the municipalities be helped to avoid land use that threatens the species, the ecosystems, and causes loss of biodiversity in all the small and large decisions that they rule over? As a basis for good decisions, the municipalities need more tools, both knowledge tools and analysis tools. They need to know what kind of effect on the ecosystem and climate their plans will have. They need to know what is the situation for the biodiversity in their geography, and they need methods for monitoring the situation and see the progress. This is not something each municipality shall solve for themselves. The state has to build these work tools in cooperations with the municipal sector and also provide good guidance. Another important issue is the big infrastructure project financed by the states, as the big roads, the hospitals, the energy infrastructure, and renewable energy as wind and hydropower, which is ruled by the energy legislations, and other national goals for transforming to a low-emission society. This infrastructure has to take into consideration not only the effect from the energy installation itself, but also the impact of on the surroundings, the influence on the biodiversity, and contribute to local green transition. There is a lack of planning capacity in many municipalities. Many of our members, especially small municipalities, have problems to get educated planners and environmental specialists. There's not educated enough of them. At last, I will mention the need of lowering the footprint from all our activities. this decoupling of waste from economic growth. The need for a more circular economy is not just a question about recycling of waste. It can also be a strategy for less need of natural resources and less land use. The Norwegian government have ambitions in that field, and we will follow that promising work closely to ensure a good national action plan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kjetil. The next is Christian Steele. Christian is a biologist and director of the NGO Sabima, who is working on to improve production management and knowledge of biodiversity and land use planning in Norway. And Sabima is also an umbrella organization for the Norwegian Natural History Societies. And Christian himself is also an active field biologist, in particularly on birds and insects. So the floor is yours. 3 minutes, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I would like to commend the Ministry for Environment for hosting this seminar and inviting the civil society organizations to comment on the report. And of course also thanks to the OECD for a very good and very significant report, I find. OECD focuses on fundamental issues for socioeconomics, prosperity, welfare, and evaluates Norway's environmental performance on this background. And this is because keeping the atmosphere in order and securing and improving natural nature capital is not a narrow special interest. It's actually a fundament for welfare and economy. And OECD concludes that Norway is a front runner on air quality, electric cars, and some other technologies and pricing, but may still not reach actual climate targets. And the same goes, and even more, for nature management. OECD clearly criticizes the result of Norway's nature management, nature protection, and land use planning. As I said in my question, the OECD lists few forerunner points in the topic of nature, land use, and biodiversity. So Norway mostly excels, I think, in protecting nature in other countries. This is also reflected by Norway losing its first place in the UN Development Index, falling to the 16th place when environment is taken into account. And I find, honestly, that it is embarrassing that we have not come further on the subject of nature in Norway. There is a global and national nature crisis in addition to the climate crisis, and the Norwegian government has acknowledged this. The negative trends are well documented, and we actually know how to solve it. So we should have done better. But rather than focusing on what is wrong, which is quite a bit, I will end by saying that we, and also then the OECD, see needs to be done, we see that is needed to be done. And firstly, it is improving land use planning and doing this through capacity building and improving systems in the municipalities. This requires funding and actually building up the capacity that the municipalities have, not just giving them all kinds of liberties. Secondly, introducing land neutrality and ecosystem accounting. This will result in a fair and predictable and systematic planning cycles, and it will reduce conflicts, and it will move the land use from pristine nature, where all these conflicts often arises, to already exploited land. Thirdly, introduce ecosystem-based management systems and also use the quality norms as described by the Nature Diversity Act. We also need to phase out the output-based subsidies of agriculture and focus more on the various outputs and ecosystem services agriculture can produce. Fifth, we need to restore much more nature. This is a very profitable investment, generally according to the Nature Panel in the rate of 10:1. And finally, make representative protection of land and sea, where we lag particularly embarrassingly behind, and not only mostly protecting rocks and snow in the mountains that we have done quite well in Norway. So this requires following the current legislation and also introducing more modern legislation and funding. So we look very much forward to the budgets in the years to come, where we can actually solve these problems. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian, with these 5 recommendations or conclusions. So the third expert comment is made by Gro Sandkjær Hansen. She has a PhD in political science and is a senior researcher at the Norwegian Institute for Urban and Regional Research at Oslo Met. And she is also professor too at the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Life Sciences. And she has also led the evaluation of the Norwegian Planning and Building Act, which also asked if nature and climate concern was ensured in Norwegian planning. And I will assume that you will comment on those issues. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you so much for the report. And from my perspective, having evaluating this Planning and Building Act, especially with a special concern on how do the Act ensure nature and climate concerns, I warmly welcome this report. And I find this to be a very comprehensive and nuanced assessment of the situation in Norway, which define our environmental management system for being relatively well functioning, but at the same time also are able to grasp the most important deficits in the Norwegian planning and land use management. So if you wonder if you got it right, George, you did. And I find the report correctly points to the fact that there is a gap between the national visions and ambitions and the end result of the everyday municipal land use decisions, that in some, adding them to each other, in some harms nature. But was not intended to. It was never the intention to harm nature. So this is, in a way, this, but the aggregated effects. So I find that the amendment we now have to do, which also you are advising us to do, is firstly, we have to now look at, we lack a nature accounting system, which allows us to observe the overall effects of land use changes on nature, the amount of nature, the state of nature value, and also the state of ecosystem services. So now we see and we follow, as researchers, several municipalities having pilots and cities having pilots. So this must become very soon mandatory for municipalities to have, because we now see that very small municipalities also are able to have these systems and to develop them themselves. So introducing this in some years as mandatory systems, which also is included in the annual KASTRA reporting from local level to national level, will really improve our knowledge base on how does land use affect nature. Secondly, like in the climate field, there must be clearer overall national goals that are optionalized to each municipalities and must be reported. And this is a very important point that the report emphasizes. And I also find your emphasis of these must be smart. And they must be also allow for the local autonomy that we have, because we have a land use system which decentralized, very strong local land use authority to local level, which allows very strong local democracy, which is important for us. So how can we have clearer national goals and also allow for local democracy to play out? What's the smartness there? And you have several advices for us to how to do that, which I find that that's where we have to work now, to find those smart mechanisms. We also need, which is the third thing we have to do, to build more competence at local level, to have more capacity as the previous speaker said, but also to have more competence and like planning competence, ecosystem competence, different varied competence to be able to grasp the whole comprehensiveness of local planning and land use planning. And also like incentives, and I also argue for a national environment appeal board is important. But I think that to work with these, this interplay, to have a better interplay between clear national goals and reporting systems, which also allow for local democracy to play out. That's the key. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gro. So may I ask all the 4 panelists to step up, Roger, Gro, Christian, and Kjetil. Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to ask Roger. You have now heard three comments which to a large extent support the report, but are there any further comments you would like to add to those?
Well, sure. First of all, it is indeed quite gratifying to hear the level of agreement and shared vision on this, but I hope it's not too surprising. I mean, one of the things that struck me along this whole process is that I've never been able to say anything that really surprised anybody, right? Like these ideas are out there already, and they've been out there for some time. So what, if we're doing anything to add value at the OECD, it's to kind of put it together in a narrative and say, okay, we're just taking a high-level look at this and see how all this can go together. And our recommendations are, they're fine. I mean, I think that we spent some time thinking about them, but on another level, I think if you sort of take it out to the very end about what we're asking, what we're envisioning, it's really quite challenging and quite dramatic. It's like use data in a closed loop way to really have a data-driven planning cycle, and that's quite. If Norway pulls that off, they'll be, I think, the first to do so. I mean, this is a very big challenge that we're saying here. Even though I'm not saying anything new that you understand, it doesn't make the challenge less difficult or important. But I think if Norway can crack that, I think they'll really be set for a very bright future indeed. So.
We have discussed, I mean, you emphasized it in the report, and it has already been commented about the law system. I mean, we have the Plan and Building Act, but we have several sectorial laws, which goes a little bit horizontal, where the Plan and Building Act to some extent in terms of land use planning is the master plan, and then we have the tire or the vertical going from what we have discussed with national goals down to via the counties down to the municipalities here. But what is the trick here? I mean, how should we go ahead by improving the coordination between these horizontal and vertical axes? So anybody would like to start to comment on that? Yes?
We think land neutrality. If you view nature and as a capital, nature capital, in the same way as you view other types of capital, you would never allow a company or a ministry or anyone to use money that you don't have. So you have an accounting system, you make budgets, and if you use more one year, you have to give back the next year. You have to make sure that the income balances the expenses and so on. So you need to do exactly the same for nature capital. Each municipality, each sector, each business needs to make that accounting system. And if you, for instance, make up for land use by requiring that you have to restore nature somewhere else to equal qualities, it would become maybe so expensive to utilize pristine nature that you would move the land use to areas where it's less pristine and easier to compensate somewhere else. And this is a system that will be fair to everyone because it's predictable, it's the same. You don't give any advantages to some people. Okay, we can give you an exception to build along the shore because this particular issue is so important. You don't do that. If somebody come to the director of finance in a company and say, we really need a big Christmas party this year because of the pandemic, the finance director will say, well, we'll have to look at the budget. Can we afford this?
Kjetil and then Gro.
We need, of course, an accounting system which is possible to use both for the local municipal level and the national level. And when we look into this in this publication, which we are presenting for the government today and in the next week for everyone else, we can see that on this field, some of the statistics are from 2018, but when we see material recycling, it's statistics from last year. And of course, old statistic, not able to be used on local level, it's a problem. And I think the main problem is that we need to understand that we have to cooperate and collaborate within our different roles in national and down to local level. We have different roles, but we have to collaborate to solve the problem. I think that's the solution in every way.
Yes.
I will also argue for strengthening the Planning and Building Act as a coordination mechanism, because and you recognize that. You recognize the importance of this coordination mechanisms that the Act is. And I will say it's the most important act for nature, because it coordinates 22 other acts to try to be a coordinating arena where those concerns in those 22 acts are being evaluated and illuminated and weighted. But something escapes from that arena, and we have to bring it into that again. The Energy Act, the windmills have escaped, and we have to bring them in on the same arena again, and they have to be asked the same that we do when we plan other things. They have to illuminate the same, they have to be weighted in the same, and also these concept choices for big infrastructure projects, like roads, and so have also escaped the very first decisions. So I think also that we have to improve coordination capacity in this intricate, multi-level, cross-sector system we have. Then you have to have stronger coordinating motors. And that Planning and Building Act can very easily be that. Because it also entails this, it respects national steering and it respects local democracy within the same act. So we have an act that balances these two concerns and have this intricate balancing. So to improve that arena.
Christian, you had a comment on that?
Yeah, I agree completely that the Planning and Building Act is very important for nature, and it needs to be improved, and that needs to be clarified, needs to have sharper and clearer demands in some areas, and we also very much need the municipalities to increase their capacity to use it properly. Because we have the debates on the national radio just the other day, where the Minister for Planning, rural areas and municipalities, he said that we need to give the municipalities more free space. And I think it's the wrong way around, because what is the problem is not the availability of land. It's the capacity and skills to plan this properly and to utilize the different possibilities properly. But thirdly, I hope you agree, well, Planning and Building Act is fine, but we also need some boundaries. Because if you have the perfect planning and still spend too much, it doesn't really help.
I would like one of those clearer national goals would be zero loss of nature.
Kjetil?
When we look upon the windmill history the last years, we can see that there's a difference in how land use is seen through these processes run by the energy legislation. compared to similar projects which had been run by the Planning and Building Act. It is completely different. And that is an example on how technology evolves and that the need for nature is growing within this project, and that has been a disaster. Another example is that when the state or national level builds a hospital or a university in an area in a geography which not is placed so that it can give complete planning processes, it undermines the possibilities to make compact cities. And of course, this has to end. It has to be a cooperation between the levels on how to reduce the land use. And there's two different examples, but two of them is connected. One of them is connected to the Planning and Building Act.
Which is why we have to catch the escapees that's been escaped the Planning and Building Act, and for instance, hydro, the energy sector, and so on.
The hospital has also escaped. You have to bring them in again.
Right.
So, Roger, how much of this debate has you recognized when you have been assessing the situation?
Well, I'm not sure if I have anything more to add on this particular point about windmills and stuff. It's such a difficult, fundamentally difficult problem. And some of the solutions are, I mean, with windmills, I don't know that it's entirely a planning problem. Sometimes it's an incentives problem. You know, like I think communities need to feel like they're sharing in the value generation of the windmill and not having something imposed. I think windmills can be a really good example of how something feels imposed from the outside. And that's something that we really, really have to work on. Like in my own country house in Paris, or outside Paris, they're trying to put in some windmills, and everyone is angry. Everyone is angry. There's leaflets everywhere. It's like, no to the windmills. And it's like, because it's just this thing that happened to the community. And that's really like a mistake, I think, fundamentally. So I think that's, everyone here recognizes that. But I wanted to...
We should put the wind turbines where the energy is used, which is where, yes, in the industrial areas, especially in the holiday house areas, right. where you actually, where people have large houses and heated, you know, outside areas. We should have one in each of those.
Especially around Paris.
I would like to give also the possibilities for the audience to ask questions for the panelists here. So anyone? Yes? Please introduce yourself and please use the mic.
I'm Harold Leffertstra and representing the Grandparents Climate Action. I have a question as an example of, there's an ongoing expansion of big road systems. And it has a strong effect on climate pollution, energy use and use of resources, and natural landscape also. Direct and indirectly. Directly is sometimes studied, but the indirect effects are very little done. You have to, you get to the big road, then comes the areas with houses, then the areas with shopping centers, and then people who want to travel to a cabin, they can travel further, so you get an expansion there. There will be more economic resources in the area, so it is a chain reaction, and that is very little identified in the process in the beginning when you are going for or having to study the project to make the decision. More modest alternatives are very often are not identified at all and studied. So you have either stay with what you have, or you need a four-lane motorway with 110 kilometers. So there's a lack of alternatives, and there's also, even if the effects are identified, they are taken in consideration in very limited degree. So how can we get out of this?
Anyone who would like to respond to that?
Can I start?
Yes.
Because you pointed the very important things that, which is when you take a land use decision, you constrain things and you set the direction for 100 years development. It's constructions that are going to be there for at least 100 years, whether it's houses or buildings or roads, at least 100 years. So the everyday decisions these municipalities take are so important for the future possibilities of which direction should we take, especially those with roads. And I think that to illuminate the 100 years effect should maybe be a requirement. Okay, this decision about that road, how do you see 100-year development regarding, for example, nature and ecosystem in the area, regarding development for economy, regarding social sustainability, to ask for more long-term thinking and long-term effects, and to illuminate that as far as you can, because then also you will illuminate that for the politicians. And I think that you have to play the politicians good. You have to inform them. You have to bring thoughts to them. You have to bring different kind of knowledge to them to enable the local politicians to be the best politicians we have, because it's so important with local democracy. So I think that one of the things you can illuminate is, for example, the nature, the function of sink, carbon storage, the carbon storage and sink function of nature. And I find there the climate discussion and the nature discussion finally meets now in ecosystem services of carbon storage. Then you can say, okay, if I build this windmill up there, I have to go into these nature areas and reduce the ability of nature to store carbon in that and that and that. And in some, the effect of the windmill will be zero. So when you are able to inform politicians about that, they might take other decisions.
Christian, very short, and Kjetil then.
First of all, I find many of the 4-lane motorways quite crazy. You drive on them quite alone. I think the level where you allow these large motorways in Norway is far too low. You wonder if you are on the route to Elverum, where they're just million, or if it's actually towards Berlin, because the road is so enormous. And I think one problem is that you have made a system where you can calculate or you think you can calculate very exact what the benefits are for society, while the value of nature is regarded as non-monetary values. And this is actually kind of a hoax, because the calculations for profit is not as exact as they presume to be. So I think we should have land use neutrality as well for all sectors, so that you don't in your municipalities don't get all the blame. If the roads had to compensate as well, they would move into reusing the old roads and improving them instead. So it was, in my view, a complete failure by the previous government to make the organization called New Roads. They should have rather constructed an organization called Old Roads. Yes.
Reuse of roads.
Indeed.
Okay, Kjetil, very short.
I think one of the problem, and maybe the main problem here, is that the full cost of using the land is not reflected when the decision is made. It's made later, or someone else has to pay for it. And that's one of the problems. So accounting system which can give us the real costs would help a lot, I think.
Okay, time is running very fast, and we have come to an end. We have discussed the need for increased national goals, clearer objectives. We need an accounting system for nature and ecosystem services, and we need to keep the local municipalities and increase their capacity. That is 3 short words from my side, and I think we will give a small hand for the panelists. Thank you very much.
Representative protection of nature, which is a clear recommendation as well.
Thank you, the panelists, from me too. And we are now moving into the last section, the conclusions. which will start with Nathalie Giraud. She's head of division in the Environmental Performance and Information Unit in the OECD. She has no microphone yet, so I can talk a little bit about everything. But after she has finished her introduction about the next steps, we will have some concluding remarks by her and Alain, and with her, and she will probably ask me what I'm going to do afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. So I don't want to keep you here for a long time, but I just would like to provide a few messages to wrap up this launch event. So you have seen today one of the activities that we are doing around the OECD Environmental Performance Program, so the EPR program. So really the key objectives, just to remind you, is that really we want to document the good practices and provide practical recommendations to support countries in their effort to strengthen policies that contribute to environmental goals and also to sustainable growth. So in figure, this program has been there at the OECD for 30 years. We've done over 100 EPR reviews, and we've gone through 3 cycles of review of the membership and also of partner countries. But Norway is the first country to complete its 4th review. So again, a front runner here. In terms of a global reach, actually, we have review partner countries. This is important. We've been through an EPR of Brazil, of China, of Indonesia, of Peru, of South Africa. We are doing very recently started work on an EPR of Egypt, and we will do Costa Rica, who's a new member of the OECD. Another important feature of this program is mutual learning, is peer-to-peer learning. The minister mentioned that also this morning. This is at the heart of the process. We want to encourage countries to improve their performance individually, but also collectively. And as we have seen today, Norway's experience may offer many interesting lessons for other OECD countries and partner countries. And in June, we will be launching the review of the United Kingdom. The UK was teamed up with Norway over the past year, and we had meetings at the Working Party on Environmental Performance earlier in the year together. So overall, in the Norway EPR, we have 30 recommendations, and we hope that you will all find them helpful and that they will be implemented over time. And in that respect, we would like to propose to Norway to conduct a midterm assessment in about 4 or 5 years. And this will be an occasion to look at what has been implemented and what is the result of that and what are the remaining recommendations that are probably more challenging to implement. The EPRs, the highlights, and also the country profile that Julia presented in her last slide. This is part of the package that we propose to the membership. So today we are launching this new country profile, so you will see it on the OECD website. We will disseminate also the good practices from Norway on different OECD publications and OECD platform, including the IPAC platform. But your help is needed here. We would like to ask you to spread the word and disseminate these messages in your respective audiences. This is important. We don't want this report to be an online library piece only. We would like to contribute to sparking the national debate around the issues that we have discussed today. Ultimately, we would like to inspire the policymakers and the business and the civil society and all of you who have spoken today to take action, to promote sound policies and move us towards a net zero and a resilient world. And to that, I really have one specific question for you, Tom, is how will you follow up with the recommendations specifically, and how will this be done to advance the debate? So now let me just thank you on behalf of the whole EPR team today, and thanks the Norwegian authority once again for being so proactive, and we had a reliable support throughout the review process. You've been a great partner with us, and it's been a true pleasure working with your team. And we look forward to continued collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you. You gave me a question, and one of the answers on what you have summed up, what you want us to do, is that we have this seminar today. That is the first move to broaden out the perspective, to give all the Norwegian society the possibility to go into this report. It has already been written a lot about it in Norwegian newspapers today. It's very good, actually. It's most about oil extraction, of course, but that's a part of the game. But I think that to some extent, it's very important for us to have this kind of reports, not because, as I think Roger said it, you know a lot, and I don't know everything you know, but have I been mistaken or whatever? But no, he hadn't been mistaken. But we know a lot, and we have a lot of information about Norwegian society, about the environmental situation and all that kind of stuff. But that doesn't mean that we are not able to learn from the outside. And we have to have someone looking upon us to say, okay, it seems like you have the good systems and everything seems to be very nice in Norway, but the outcome isn't that good all the places. So what could you actually do different? And you look upon us, and that makes a different discussion than what we have in Norway, which is based on more traditional, what should I say, the people standing in the NGOs, meaning this, standing in the industrial organization, meaning this, and the dynamics is not very easy to get all the time. So it's very, what should I say, nice for us to have a view from the outside telling us, yeah, but that's a little bit strange when it comes to Norway. Why do we not do it different? So, and I think being on a very general level, I would say that Norway is a very successful society. There's no reason to doubt that. It also means that we have a very high trust in our society. One of the reasons why we have high trust is that we have a knowledge-based society. It means that we have knowledge-based, we have a high educated population, and we are discussing openly what's going on. And that's very important when it comes to how to deal also with environmental problems in the future. And I think that this report is a part of this knowledge-based basis. We learn a little bit more about ourselves, and that means that we can follow up later on. And I won't be specific. Much of this is about politics and not just about bureaucracy, which I'm a part of. But when it comes to the more, what shall I say, important recommendation, I would point to one thing which is said in this report and also in the economic performance review of Norway, is that we are a society which should be very good positioned to make a just transition, because a just transition in the green recovery is fundamental. It's fundamental for the government in Norway, but they're also fundamental for all governments around the world. And if Norway is not able, who should be able? And that is pointed out in this report and also in the economic performance review. And because sometimes when you're sitting in Norway, you are feeling all the problems in Norway. But all countries, all governments around the world do also feel the problems. But if we feel the problems with just transition as problematic as in less developed countries in the world, how should we then do the green recovery or reach the global climate goals? So I think that's a very important advice for us and what we should follow up. And I think all Norwegian politicians, to some extent, agree on this, or not all, but most of them. But then we have to, how should we actually deal to fix this? How should we have these taxes on CO2, for instance? We need them higher, but we need to do it in a just way. How to deal with that? We as bureaucrats should be better in understanding that, and you have told us we should be the front runner in this area. And as I told you from the team earlier, I have some favorites in the report when it comes to recommendations. So I read two of my favorites just to sum up here, because I think it's, for me, it's very interesting for when OECD went into this special topic about land use and that kind of stuff. I was very interested in this. They moving into it because, yeah, as an economist, this is not what you are best in, I would say. It's not your favorite area because it's a little bit difficult to find a formal framework for it. So, but OECD, they are great. They could do it. And OECD said a lot about this, and as you heard in the panel now, the experts in Norway think the OECD recommendations are very good. I point to two of them. I end up with that. The first one is when it comes to biodiversity, where you say, Norway needs to continue developing a management system for ecosystem types as foreseen in a biodiversity action plan, and set, aggressive timelines for implementation. Aggressive. You heard that. It can build momentum for success by regularly assessing ecological status and set specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound objectives accordingly. That's a very strong recommendation for Norwegian policymakers. And the other one is maybe my real favorite. It's about land use. Norway's progress on policies, planning, and spending on ecosystem is not matched by strongly improved outcomes. Improved horizontal and vertical coordination can improve effectiveness in other contexts. Norway has developed a number of approaches for planning and decision-making and has embraced good practices that could be applied to land use planning to make it more holistic and successful. Spot on. Thank you, OECD. And thank you for the seminar to everybody here.